So now what we want to do is make it so that when we just simulate and the character is stationary, his legs aren't lifting up for no reason. We want it to only make them lift when the character's moving, but we don't want it to just be on or off, so it's either lifting or it's not lifting. We want it to gradually go from lifting a very small amount or infinitely small and just zero towards whatever maximum value as it increases in speed. So it won't just suddenly start moving the legs. It will gradually, so if it's moving slowly, there'll be a small amount of lift. If it's moving faster, it will lift more, up to a certain limit. We're not going to let it go infinitely if it goes even faster than that, so we'll have a maximum value. But essentially, we want it to just ramp up from no lift whatsoever when it's stationary to some lift. So a simple way that we can do that is where we've got this evaluate curve in our move feet transforms function. What we can do, instead of just having the target maximum set to 100 as a static value, we can instead use our calculated velocity. So in our My Blueprint section on the left, you've got calculated velocity as a vector. So we're going to drag that in and do get calculated velocity. We're going to drag out from this and do length. So as we did before, we get the length of the vector, which is converting it from a vector to just a float value. So this is the speed. And we're going to map this from whatever value range it is currently towards the height value that we want to add. So drag out from the result and search for remap. And the result, let's just plug the result into the target maximum for now. So I'm just going to explain basically what this remap node does, because it's a very useful node that I use throughout any procedural setup, because it's just so easy to use, simple, and very quick to make tweaks and changes. So what we could do is try doing it through a curve, where we would map from, if it's a low speed, we would do a low lift height, and if it gets to a higher speed, we do a higher one, and so on. But that's quite difficult to manipulate and test different values of. Whereas a remap node is very simple. So what a remap node is doing is it's taking whatever the input is, and from some range, so the minimum to the maximum, and it maps that to the target, so the output minimum and maximum. So for example, if the source minimum is 0 and the source maximum is 1, and we plug in a value of 0.5, we're halfway between the minimum and the maximum. So the value it outputs will be halfway between the target minimum and the target maximum. So let's say we plug in 0.5 and it's 0 to 1, but then the target minimum is 0 and the target maximum is 500. It would map the 0.5, which is halfway through this range, to halfway through this range, which would be 250. And also we can have the numbers reversed. So for example, we could do 200 in the target minimum and we could do 100 in the target maximum. So it's actually a lower number for the maximum. And if we input a value of 0.5, again, it would be halfway between these two. So it would be halfway between these two, and it would give us a value of 150. So in our case, what we want to do, we've got the calculated velocity. So let's put some reasonable values for the minimum and maximum for what the velocity could be. So the minimum is 0 because it can just be stationary. The maximum, let's say the maximum is 400 units a second. So if it goes beyond that, the lift height won't increase because we're going to tick the clamp tick box. So what this means is it can never go above the target maximum. So the highest it could ever be is whatever value would be if it was a 400 input. So even if we input at 800, it's not going to double up the target maximum because we've got the clamp on. So the minimum output we want is 0, so no lift whatsoever. And maybe the target maximum we have at 100 because that's what we had before from this curve. We had it going to 100. I think that may be a little bit high, but let's just keep it like that for now. So when you compile, and remember that this result should be plugged into the target maximum here, you should see that because the character is stationary in this viewport, that the legs aren't lifting at all. But if we go and simulate, all the legs are still on the ground, and you click the character and start moving him, now you can see the legs start to lift. So they're responding to how fast the character is actually moving. So if it's moving very slowly, you'll see that the legs aren't lifting too far at all. And if it starts moving faster, that's when the legs start lifting higher. Now, as I mentioned, I think 100 is too high. I'm going to change this down to 50. So the highest it could ever lift is 50 units. So I'll compile, save, and simulate again. And this looks a little bit more natural to me. And feel free to play around with these values. And at this stage, you might want to feel free to play around with some of the other values. So for example, you could change the swing percent, so how much of the time it's spent in the swing phase as opposed to the lock phase. So you could try a lower or higher value for that. You can change different values for this target maximum, which affects the lift height. And feel free to play around with anything else. But I would probably recommend just making a copy of the current version, just so you can go back to where you were in case you make any changes, such as you change the target lock distance maybe, so the feet don't lock to the floor as much, and you forget that you've changed that value, and then you don't know how to get it back because it's just lost in all these variables. It might be worth just saving a copy just so you don't mess everything up. But as I've mentioned before, there is a folder where we've got completed stages, where you'll see different stages that have been saved. So you can revert to those if you want, but those are my versions. It would be helpful if you're saving your own versions, just so you can keep continuing on from where you left off with the project, if you ever have to revert back to some previous version.